Addis Business Talk with Khalid and Marid on Afro FM 105.3. We'll be talking to policymakers, investors, business leaders, and entrepreneurs to bring you the latest development taking place in the Ethiopian economic and business climate, and more importantly, what it means to you.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. This is Addis Business Talk with Khalid and Marid every Thursday morning on Afro FM 105.3, the first all-English radio and podcast business show in Ethiopia. My name is Marid Bisrat, along with my co-host, Khalid Mawi. Thank you for joining us. The show is brought to you by Pragma Investment Advisory, an investment management and advisory firm based in Addis Ababa, along with our partners, Tufaiphone Communications, a very prominent PR and marketing firm also based in Addis Ababa. In today's episode, we will talk with two guests from Center for International Private Enterprise, in short, CIPE. CIPE is one of the four core institutes of National Endowment for Democracy and affiliate of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. To tell us about CIPE, who they are, what they do in Ethiopia, and to talk about the private sector in general, we have invited Hailemelekot Asfaw, Country Director for CIPE East Africa Regional Office, and Getachew, Program Manager to CIPE East Africa Regional Office. Hailemelekot and Getachew, a warm welcome to Addis Business Talk, and thank you for joining us, gentlemen.
Thank you, Marid and Khalid, for having us on the program.
It's a pleasure to have you, sir.
Right.
Let's start our conversation talking about you guys telling us who is CIPE, what do you do, and how do you? I know that you support the private sector here in Ethiopia, and how do you support the private sector in Ethiopia? First, let me direct my first question to Mr. Hailemelekot.
Okay. Let me start by saying the full name for CIPE. CIPE stands for Center for International Private Enterprise. It's an international non-profit organization. It was established 37 years ago in 1983 in the US. CIPE is one of the four core institutes for the National Endowment for Democracy, NED. CIPE is also an affiliate to the US Chamber of Commerce. So CIPE is between democracy and private sector or business. Our mission is to strengthen democracy around the globe through private sector enterprises and market-oriented reform. So CIPE promotes democracy and good governance through active participation of the private sector. Currently, CIPE has active programs in more than 17 countries, especially in emerging and transitional economies that includes Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East, and also Eastern European countries. I think I should talk a little bit about the role of CIPE in Ethiopia. CIPE has been supporting the Ethiopian private sector for the last 15 years from distance. Why I'm saying from distance? 2 years ago, CIPE had no any legal existence in Ethiopia, even though it had a very active programs across the country. So for the last 15 years, CIPE was working in Ethiopia with close collaboration of local business membership organizations and local consulting companies on the private sector development. With the emerging or the ongoing political and economic reform in Ethiopia for the last 2 years, CIPE managed to open its East Africa Regional Office at the end of August 2018. So currently, CIPE has more than 100 partner business membership organizations, mainly Chamber of Commerce's sector-based associations, women entrepreneurial associations, and also to some extent, members of the civil society group, think tank and research institutions, as well as the local media. In terms of programs, we have a very broad program in terms of capacity building to the private sector. So when I say private sector, I'm talking about business membership organizations. So for the last 7-8 years, we were providing capacity building training programs to the leaders of the Ethiopian private sector, especially to the chamber system. 4 or 5 years ago, we managed to establish the Chamber Academy, which is hosted by the National Chamber, the Ethiopian Chamber of Commerce and Sectoral Association. So through that platform, Chamber Academy, we try to provide for the chamber leadership as well as professionals within associations. So when we talk chambers and business associations, we have two kinds of people. The first layer is leaders which are elected every 2-3 years. These people are usually, we call them officials to the private sector. And most of them, even though they come from business, but they don't have really know-how about the governance, leadership, management. So we try to provide training programs on these thematic areas. And the second layer, we have professionals within the chamber, professional people. So for those people, we try to provide skill kind of oriented programs. So capacity building program, the first major pillar for CIPE program in Ethiopia. The second major pillar for CIPE in Ethiopia is PPD, public-private dialogue. Our focus is more of to the regions. Some of the big institutions like the World Bank and IFC, they try to support the National Chamber to have a dialogue with the federal government. But our focus for the last 7-8 years was mainly supporting the regional Chamber of Commerce and sectoral associations to engage with their counterpart regional governments to discuss on business related issues and to come up with solutions based on evidence-based kind of solutions to the private sector. The third pillar in terms of program to CIPE in Ethiopia is anti-corruption and compliance. As you know, for many years, the Ethiopian government tried to address the issue through public sector. Usually the focus was on public institutions and public officials. But when we talk about corruption, at least there are two main players, or there is a supply and demand. So usually if you see the supply side goes to the private sector and the demand side goes to the public sector. So our engagement is encouraging the private sector to engage on anti-corruption and compliance program, at least to minimize the effect of corruption on the economy. So through this program, we have cooperative agreement with Addis Chamber of Commerce and the Sectoral Association, and we are providing different kind of capacity building activities to the private sector. The fourth major pillar for CIPE is empowering marginalized communities in the economic groups, especially women and young people. So we should encourage women and young people to play their positive role in terms of job creation, to have a healthy private sector. The last one, we have a pilot program which is still ongoing for the last 3 years. We call it entrepreneurship ecosystem. So through this program, we try to encourage local small businesses to have or to create some kind of B2B, business-to-business linkage with the international investors, especially those companies who are operating within the industry parks. So we have a pilot program in Hawassa through the city chamber, Hawassa Chamber of Commerce, and we are encouraging the local business community to come up with all kinds of initiatives to engage and to have business with international companies within the industrial park. So these are some of the major programs we're having in Ethiopia.
Thank you very much, Ato Hailemelekot, for that comprehensive answer. Now, with respect to the prevalent issue that has taken over most discussions, in your overall sort of socioeconomic assessment, how do you see the impact of COVID-19 on the private sector in Ethiopia? And would you say the government's response efforts or mitigation plan against the pandemic has been sufficient or not?
Well, as to me, COVID-19 is very complex, and in terms of when we discuss about COVID, we touch everything. So COVID is complicating all kind of life, the political, economic, diplomacy, in all aspects of our day-to-day life. So COVID, when we talk about the impact of COVID in Ethiopia, is affecting our political system. Everybody knows that because of COVID, the country forced to postpone its national election, even though for the last few days we start hearing that the federal parliament is on the way to decide to have the national election. But still, it has a big impact on the political process of the country. When we talk about economic impact, let me give you some data, official data so far we get from government sources. According to the Ministry of Finance, the Ethiopian economy growth will be, it's an estimation, it will be 8.5 in terms of percentage for the 2020-21 fiscal year. And in terms of job, according to the Job Creation Commission, because of COVID, the formal economy is going to lose up to 1.2 million jobs. So you could imagine the impact on the economy. It's not easy really in this country to lose 1.2 million jobs. Again, I want to stress on this point, it's so easy to imagine the impact of COVID on the informal economy. COVID really affects some sectors in special cases, especially the hotel industry. When we see the study conducted by the Ethiopian Hotel Owners Association and the Ethiopian travel and tourism sector could see a reduction in growth up to 30% due to COVID. This study indicated that about 88% of the hotels in Addis Ababa are either partially or fully closed. And monthly, due to COVID, the hotel industry is losing $35 million. In terms of inflation, it has been increasing from time to time. The monthly aggregate inflation for the month of April, I'm talking about, I don't have the recent data, so I'm talking about for the month of April. It was around 18.3%. Out of the aggregate, the food inflation for that particular month is around 22.3%. So you could imagine in terms of the inflation as well. On policy measures, the federal as well as the regional governments, they took several measures. When we talk about the federal government, the federal government provided around 15 billion to support the private banks because the financial institutions are also significantly affected by COVID. And also the Development Bank of Ethiopia, they try to avail around 4.5 billion birr as a soft loan to support the small and medium enterprises. The federal government also given income tax relief and extension of payment of some outstanding payments such as employee pension contribution for the private sector businesses. So these are some of the major policy measures which were taken by the federal government, at least to alleviate the impact. But personally, I feel that the federal government, as well as the regional governments, they should take more positive measures, at least to mitigate the impact of COVID-19 on the local economy.
Wonderful. Let's talk about seeing the future. And of course, as you mentioned, COVID has had a lot of effect in the economy. As you know, since the Prime Minister Abiy came to power, his government has announced a lot of economic reforms. One of it is the Homegrown Economic Reform Plan, and recently the Planning and Development Commission has announced the 10 years economic reform plan. In that plan, it tries to address the key sectors which lead Ethiopia into prosperity, in order to make Ethiopia as the beacon of prosperity here in Africa. They tried to address the agriculture, the manufacturing industry, the mining, tourism, urban development, and innovation in technology. So, and also the government is working on the privatization of the telecom sector and the liberalization also of the telecom sector. So there, as you see, there is a lot of development in terms of opening up the sector and also for giving needed focus for these key sectors. Considering all this change and the government's effort in order to reform the economy, where do you see Ethiopia's economy in the future?
I think I should give this chance to my colleague Getachew.
Yeah. Okay. So just to reflect on these points, I think the Ethiopia's development paths over the last 15, 16 years have largely been dominated by public investment and largely has been swayed towards the state-led development model. And that model, despite the fact that it has actually managed to bring about fast GDP expansion in the economy, it had a negative impact of crowding out the private sector out of the mainstream key areas of private sector. Economic engagements. So the private sector was largely having less of a space in the economy, and the policy measures that were being taken at the time were largely focused on aggregate economic indicators instead of identifying key sectors where there is higher growth potentials and optimizing the growth opportunity that exists on those sectors. So is the coming into scene of the homegrown economic reform agenda. I think one of the key recognitions that we see is in this agenda is the commitment for putting the private sector at the center of the economic development in the country. And also, unlike the previous times where private sector was considered to be rhetorically as an engine of growth, but not in practical terms, the homegrown economic reform agenda actually puts a plan on how the private sector could actually be the real engine of economic growth and job creation in the Ethiopian economy. So I think that's a big shift in terms of policy orientation, and also following the homegrown economic reform agenda, which actually hits the stage generally for the macroeconomic orientation of the country. What we see as follow-ups like improvements in the investment environment, amendments to the investment laws in the country, amendments to the business registration laws in the country and procedures in the country, and adjustments in the finance sector are all opening the venue for the private sector to take the lead in the economy. So I think the homegrown economic reform agenda really paves that road for enhanced role of private sector in the Ethiopian economy in the future. But that doesn't mean the assignment is done. There is a lot that needs to be done in terms of like improving institutional capacity, particularly of the state, because still service provision for the private sector seems to be really, really challenged or that advanced. It still takes much time to actually for the private sector to get services from state institutions, both in terms of facilitating the things for the private sector and as well as making the environment conducive. The public institutions still need to do serious reforms in many aspects. But I think we already have started a journey with the coming into scene of the homegrown economic reform agenda. And that's the positive side, I think. In terms of the new prospective 10-year plan that is just rolled out by the National Planning Commission, I think that's also partly a change in the game, because over the last 20 years or over 20 years plus, we have been planning only for 5 years. Yeah. And the planning has largely been really state-oriented, and less of a space was given actually for private sector. With this new prospective plan by the National Planning Commission, I think private sector has taken an important space in the plan, and actually areas where the private sector could take a lead and could play an important role in the economy has explicitly been mentioned. And we are seeing sort of a new policy commitment for really helping the private sector to be competitive and take its right place in the economy. So I think the future seems to be really hopeful for the Ethiopian private sector. But that doesn't mean actually that there are no challenges. I mean, the private sector has to also do its own assignment, because with the liberalization of many sectors and with the privatization of key strategic state-owned enterprises, if the local private sector is actually to assume its rightful place in the economy, it needs to actually strengthen its institutional capacity. It needs to modernize and invest, particularly in research and development, in human resources, and in key areas like the digitalization of their operations. Because unless otherwise the local private sector actually starts to invest in these areas and try to position itself rightly, once the space is open for competition, I think it's going to be survival of the fittest. So there is a lot that needs to be done by the private sector, But I think from a general perspective and from seeing the sort of new commitment that's coming from the state and policymakers, we believe that we as the Center for International Private Enterprise, and as an individual economist, I see that the future is hopeful for the private sector.
Well, on that positive and optimistic note, that wraps up our session. Thank you very much, Aito Hailemelekot and Aito Getachew from CIPE, for taking part in these important discussions and shedding some light on your organization, as well as for sharing your expert insight on economic matters in Ethiopia. We hope to have you on the show again soon. Until then, thank you very much.
Addis Business Talk with Khalid and Marid on Afro FM 105.3. We'll be talking to policymakers, investors, business leaders, and entrepreneurs to bring you the latest development taking place in the Ethiopian economic and business climate, and more importantly, what it means to you.